Should you buy or should you rent in today's housing market? This is a question I've been asked a lot recently with so many things taking place in the housing market between house prices hitting all-time highs, interest rates soaring over the past few months, and rent prices climbing at astronomical rates. So with all these changes taking place, I figured that now might be the perfect time to address this question, whether it makes more sense to buy or more sense to rent a home. And so with all these changes taking place, when we look at this, you might actually be surprised with the answer we find. What's up, guys? It's James out, the Out-of-State Investor, and before I get started, do me a favor and support the channel by smashing that like button, and if you haven't already done so, definitely subscribe and hit that notification bell to watch more content like this. And with that said, let's jump into it. Many people believe that buying a house is one of the biggest parts of the American dream. And so if you were to ask the question whether it makes more sense to rent a house or to buy a house, people might look at you kind of funny. They might be thinking, well, what is there even to debate about this? Well, the truth is there's actually a lot to think about when it comes to either renting or buying a house. One of the first things you have to consider is, where do you live? You see, renting or buying can look significantly different depending on the city you're in. In some cities, it might be much cheaper to rent than to buy, and in other cities it may be much cheaper to buy than to rent. For instance, in Cleveland, Ohio, the average rent for a single family home is about $1,400 a month. But if you were to look at the average mortgage payment in Cleveland, you'd be looking at just over $1,000 a month, and that's only with a 5% down payment. Whereas in Los Angeles, the average rent for a single family home is about $3,400 a month, whereas if I was to buy, the average monthly mortgage payment I have to make is about $5,000 a month. So it's significantly cheaper to rent a house in Los Angeles than it is to buy. So depending on where you live, it could make more sense to buy or it could make more sense to rent. But ultimately, these are pretty extreme examples I'm talking about, and there's everything in between there too. So because of that, it's very important to take into consideration other factors in addition to that. For starters, what is your plan? Are you planning to live in this house for a long time, or is this more of a transitional type of house? The reason I bring this up is it's really expensive to buy and sell a house. You see, there's things like closing costs, you have realtor fees, you have inspection costs, appraisal fees, and when you add all of this together, you could be looking at tens of thousands of dollars every single time you buy and sell a house. So because of that, I'm going to say at this stage in the market where we've seen several years of significant appreciation, that right now you really want to be careful with speculating for any future appreciation. There is a chance that we could see some corrections in some markets as far as price is concerned. So what I would say is that if you're not planning on living in this house for a minimum of 5 to 7 years, don't look at buying a house right now. You see, interest rates have spiked over the past several months, and current interest rates are more than double what they were a year ago. So when you take that into account, along with the fact that we're at all-time high housing prices, we have the most unaffordable housing that we've seen since 2006, according to the National Association of Realtors. Now, in addition to that, inventory is starting to build in certain markets like the Phoenix, Arizona market. We've been seeing inventory to start to build up, supply is growing, and that is starting to have a cooling-like effect on the housing market. So you really don't want to be in a position where you have to sell, and unfortunately, because the market tanked, you're unable to sell without taking a massive loss. And either way, even if you're not taking a massive loss, you're still taking a loss of whatever it costs to pay the realtor fees, the closing costs, and all that goes into it, those tens of thousands of dollars that go out the window the second that you sell your house. So that's one of the biggest pros of renting, is you're going to gain that flexibility, and that's really important, especially in what could be possibly a recession coming up. You want to have that flexibility so that if you were to lose your job hypothetically or see a dip in your income, you have that flexibility to move when the lease is done. You can go to somewhere more affordable, and you're not locked into that 30-year fixed rate where your only option to get out of it is selling it. You don't have to worry about foreclosure if the market tanked and you have no ability to sell, because you have that flexibility to leave once the lease is up. Many times you can actually break your lease early if your landlord's willing to come to terms with you on that. But with that said, one of the cons with renting is that rent in general is going to go up every year. Now, typically with a mortgage payment, you don't have to worry about that because you're typically getting a 30-year fixed mortgage. Although we are starting to see more adjustable rate mortgages come into play, I would highly recommend staying away from those. But for 30-year fixed rate mortgages, you have the same same mortgage payment every single year for 30 years. Whereas with rents have been going up significantly lately. So that's one of the biggest cons when it comes to renting, is you can typically expect about 3 to 5% annual growth. Recently we've been seeing more double-digit growth, but it can't sustain for the long term. So even with a recession looming, I would still anticipate rents to keep growing, because ultimately everybody that's been priced out of the housing market, where are they going to go? They need a place to live still, so they're going to rent if they can't buy, which means there's going to be more rental demand on the single family market. So that's really one of the main benefits, is if you plan on living in the house over the long term, you don't have to deal with those annual rent raises when you're a homeowner, so that makes more sense. Plus you also get the benefits of appreciation over time, which again, it may not come over these next 5 years, but over the long term, you could still see significant appreciation, as we've seen historically in the housing market, in addition to principal pay down as you pay down your mortgage payment, as opposed to just paying rent to your landlord. Those reasons I spoke about between principal pay down and appreciation is a big reason why the average homeowner has an average net worth of $255,000, whereas opposed to the average renter has an average net worth of $6,500. Huge difference. So for the average person out there, if you're able to afford comfortably the cost of buying a house and you're willing to live in it for the long term, then generally speaking, it's going to make more sense for you to buy than it is to rent. You see, about 2/3 of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, which means they're not investing their money, they're not improving their financial future, and by having a mortgage payment, it at least forces them to have like a forced savings account by building equity, by paying down their mortgage, and by having that appreciation over time. Now, if you're an above average person financially, and by that I mean someone who's able to have disposable income on a monthly basis, they're able to save more than 15% of their income on a monthly basis, then you may want to consider the other option, which is renting. The biggest thing you need to consider, aside from all the other things I've already brought up, is opportunity cost. Now, this opportunity cost is going to be the biggest factor when it comes to places that are cheaper to rent than it is to buy. So think like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, places like that. So let's use Los Angeles for our example, because I'm familiar with Los Angeles, and right now the median sales price for a single family home in Los Angeles is $900,000. So if you were to put down a 20% down payment, that would be $180,000 set aside for your down payment, and separate from that, you would need probably about $15,000 or so for your closing costs, and of course you have inspections and things like that. So altogether, you're really just shy of $200,000 that you would need in order to buy this house. Now, I'm going to use a real life example for a $900,000 house in Los Angeles. Based on the mortgage payment, with 20% down, your mortgage is going to be about $720,000, which means you're going to be paying $4,179 a month if you're at a 5.7% interest rate. Now, property taxes for this property are at about $938 a month, and insurance would probably be somewhere around $165 a month. Also, whenever it comes to home ownership, you have to factor in maintenance. It's something that every homeowner has to consider when it comes to cost of ownership. You see, as a renter, you don't have to worry about the cost of maintenance because it's not your property. It's really the landlord's responsibility, but as a homeowner, it falls on your shoulders. So when it comes to maintenance, let's start with lawn maintenance. With lawn maintenance, we're looking at about $125 a month for this property, let's say. And then when it comes to other types of maintenance, let's say you got a budget for future roof repair, future HVAC repair, future any kind of repairs that come up with the house in general, we'll budget an extra $200 a month for that. So in total, for a median priced house in Los Angeles, you're looking at a monthly payment of about $5,619 a month. Now, if you were to rent out that same exact house, according to Zillow, the Zestimate has it at about $2,800 a month, but Zestimates can be a little bit sketchy, so I did a little bit more research and I figured that that house would probably, based on the comparables, rent out for more like $3,200 a month. Also, don't forget that you don't have to worry about maintenance typically as a tenant. Now, some scenarios the landlord may require you to cover the cost of lawn maintenance. They'll never require you to cover the cost of regular maintenance, as far as like if the HVAC breaks down or something like that. But as far as lawn maintenance goes, sometimes the landlord might have the tenant do it, sometimes the landlord will cover it. So in this example, we'll just assume the landlord is covering covering the lawn maintenance. So with that said, this is the opportunity cost I'm talking about. Not only do you save the $200,000 that you would be putting towards the down payment and the closing costs and the inspections and all that stuff, you could be investing that $200,000 into cash flowing real estate, into stocks that are making money over time. But in addition to that, on a monthly basis, you're going to be saving yourself $2,400 a month, which when you times that by 12, you're saving yourself over $29,000 a year that could be going into investments, making you 8 to 10% every single year. But is all of that money that could be invested enough to make up for the fact that you're not building any equity because all your rent is going straight to the landlord, you're not paying any mortgage down, and you're not gaining any appreciation over time? Well, let's take a look at that. Starting with principal paydown, what you're going to find is over the life of the mortgage, you're going to pay mostly interest up front, and it's only really on the back end of the mortgage that you finally pay the principal down. And that's one of the biggest scams the banks have going on, is they try to get you to keep refinancing over and over and over again, and you never really pay much of that principal down because you're constantly refinancing into better rates and you're paying mostly interest the entire time. So we're going to compare 5 years of ownership versus 5 years of renting head to head. And so in this case, for the first 5 years of ownership, as far as principal paydown is concerned, you would take your mortgage balance from $720,000 down to about just over $674,000, meaning you built about just over $45,000 in equity from principal paydown. Then you have appreciation, which, assuming you have a 3% annual appreciation rate over the next 5 years, so we're going to assume there's not a downturn, you're going to see upside over the next 5 years. In that situation, your value of the house will have gone from $900,000 to just over $1 million, netting you about $143,000 in equity. So altogether, when you combine the equity gain with your principal paydown and your appreciation, you've gained about $189,000, which you can add to your down payment that you initially put down of $180,000. You basically turned your money into $369,000. Now, if you were to rent, you could hypothetically invest that $200,000 you had for the down payment and closing costs and inspections into something like stocks or cash flowing real estate. Then on top of that, you have the extra $2,419 a month that you're netting because, of course, it's cheaper to rent than to own in California. So you can use that extra cash flow to pour it into investments as well. So if you were to invest all of that money into, let's say, the S&P 500, which averages an 8% return annually, what you'd find is you will have gone from $200,000 to over $477,000. So in this situation, you would end up with $477,000 as a renter versus $369,000 as a homeowner. But that's not even the whole picture yet, because you haven't even sold the house and you don't actually get the money until you sell the house. And remember, there's a lot of costs that go into selling that house. So if you were to sell your house at that new price that has gone up to a $1.04 million, then you'd have to set aside at least 6% of that for your realtor fees and closing costs that you're going to incur when you sell the house. So that adds up to a total of $62,600 that you have to take away from the profit that you made. So instead of netting $369,000, you're really only netting $306,400 now. So as you can see, in this situation, it made way more sense to rent than to buy, because as the renter, you went from $200,000 to $477,000 in that 5-year period, and as a homeowner, you went from $200,000 to $306,000. Now, it's important to understand there's a lot of variables at play with this. I mean, your appreciation could be much better, or it could be much worse. Maybe there's a downturn that takes place. At the same time, it may not be that much cheaper to rent than it is to own. Maybe it's pretty close as far as ownership is concerned versus renting. Regardless, it's going to be a different answer for everybody. And the reason I ended up going with a 3% appreciation for my example is because right now we could be at the peak of the housing market. So you really, at this stage of the market, don't want to be banking on any appreciation over the short term. In fact, many experts are actually saying they believe that price drops may be taking place as far as just the median sales price is concerned. Now, personally, I don't think that's going to happen on a nationwide level, but definitely some markets are already showing signs that that's going to be happening. Overall, there's pros and cons each way, whether you're renting or you're buying a house. But for the average person, I would highly recommend trying to get into home ownership as soon as possible if you're willing to live in the house for the long run, and on top of that, you can afford it comfortably. But for those that have that disposable income, those that have that room that they can invest that money every single month, you have options, and it's worth exploring depending on what your lifestyle's like, the flexibility you're looking for, and the kind of money you're netting, and maybe the market you're living in as to what makes more sense, whether it makes more sense to rent or to own your house. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you did, do me a favor and smash that like button, and if you haven't already done so, definitely subscribe and hit that notification bell to watch more content like this. Also, let me know in the comments below, do you own or do you rent your house? Finally, follow me on TikTok and Instagram at The Out of State Investor. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.